God is all-knowing. The Bible says nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of Him to whom we must give account. Perfect being theology also supports this idea. According to this line of thinking, God is the greatest being that could possibly exist. This means that whatever great-making properties God has, He has them to the maximum. So God doesn't just have some knowledge or even a lot of knowledge. No, if God is the greatest conceivable being, He must have infinite knowledge. This property is called omniscience. It means that God knows everything that's true and does not believe anything that's false. But does it make sense to say that God is omniscient? Let's look at several challenges to this idea. First, if God knows in advance everything that happens, then isn't everything fated to occur? For example, if God already knows that tomorrow you will eat pizza for lunch, then aren't you unalterably locked into that choice? When tomorrow comes, how could you possibly choose anything else? God knows what you're going to do, and God is never wrong. To understand this argument for fatalism, we need to clarify two important terms: necessary and contingent. When an action is necessary, it cannot possibly be otherwise. It's inevitable. On the other hand, when an action is contingent, it is not necessarily the case. It could have been otherwise. Now let's look at the argument. First, it's necessarily true that if God knows something will happen, then it will happen. So, if God knows that you will eat pizza tomorrow, then you will eat pizza tomorrow. Second, suppose that God knows you will eat pizza tomorrow. Third, therefore the fatalist infers, necessarily you will eat pizza tomorrow. And since you will necessarily eat pizza tomorrow, your choice is not a free choice. It is fated to occur. In other words, God's omniscience entails fatalism. The problem with this argument is that it's just logically invalid. From premises 1 and 2, it follows merely that you will eat pizza tomorrow. It's not that you will necessarily eat pizza, it's only that you will eat pizza. It does not follow from premises 1 and 2 that your choice is necessary or inevitable. Your choice to eat pizza is contingent. When the time comes, you could choose to eat tacos instead, but you won't. What happens here, I think, is that fatalists confuse certainty with necessity. Since God is infallible, we can be absolutely certain that whatever God knows will happen. But the fact that God knows in advance that an event will happen does not imply that the event happens necessarily or inevitably. Those who infer that necessarily you will eat pizza tomorrow are thus guilty of committing a basic logical fallacy. But fatalists press their objection further, pointing out that the past is unchangeable. If some event is in the past, then it's now too late to change it. If God knew yesterday that you're going to eat pizza for lunch tomorrow, then God's past knowledge of that future event cannot be altered. It's locked in forever. So, in their revised argument, fatalists have changed the second premise. Now, it's necessarily true that God knows you will eat pizza. But now the argument fails because the revised second premise is not true. And here's why. Suppose that God has always believed that on Saturday Jones would mow his lawn. If Jones were to decide not to mow his lawn, then God would have always held a different belief than the one he in fact holds. So, Jones has the ability to act in such a way that if he were to act in that way, God would have had different foreknowledge than he does. For if Jones were to decide not to mow his lawn, as he is free to do, then different future contingent propositions would have been true, and God, being omniscient, would have known them. Thus, he would have had different foreknowledge than that which he in fact has. So, God's foreknowledge doesn't prejudice anything. When the time comes, Jones is completely free to mow or not mow his lawn. And God's foreknowledge perfectly tracks whichever option he freely chooses. That's why premise 2 is false. Since the past is, by definition, what has already occurred, fatalists are right when they say it's logically impossible to change the past. For that would be to make something that has occurred not to have occurred, which is a self-contradiction. In exactly the same sense, we cannot change the future either. For that would be to bring it about that something that will happen will not happen, which is a self-contradiction. So the immutability of the past is nothing more than a red herring. It doesn't support the case for fatalism. What's important here is that we have the ability not to change the past, but to act in such a way that the past would have been different. A third objection to God's omniscience holds that since the future is not determined, it's impossible for anyone, even God, to know what will happen. In responding to this objection, it's helpful to think about two models of divine cognition, the perceptualist model and the conceptualist model. The perceptualist model says that God knows things through something like sense perception. God looks and sees what's there. This model is implicitly assumed when people say that God foresees the future. This model runs into real problems when it comes to God's knowledge of the future, because future events don't exist. There is nothing there to perceive. By contrast, on a conceptualist model of divine knowledge, God does not acquire his knowledge of the world by anything like perception. He doesn't look down the corridors of time and see what lies in the future. Rather, God's knowledge is self-contained. It's innate. Knowing all true propositions, including future contingent propositions, is simply one of God's essential properties. As long as we're not seduced into thinking of divine foreknowledge on the model of perception, it's hard to see why God's knowledge of future contingent events should be impossible. So, God's omniscience, including his knowledge of future truths, is not only coherent, it's perfectly compatible with human free will. In fact, it's awesome. It means God knows everything you have ever done or will do. So there's no point in hiding from God. He knows you thoroughly, and yet he loves you completely. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it.